Siman Sadi Test. Let's conclude Sif Aleph, leaving off where we left off yesterday. We learned yesterday the halacha that the bones of Isser are mitzaref levatel the Isser. Meaning, if I have 59 parts of Heter, 59 zaysim of Heter, and I have a piece of Nevela that is 2 kizaysim, but it's effectively only one zayis because only one zayis is meat and one zayis is bone. Now I throw that whole thing into my 59 zaysim of heter. The halacha is, says the Mechaber, that everything is mutter. Why is everything mutter? It sounds an anomaly. It sounds like it doesn't make sense. The reason is because the bone of the nevela is mitzareh 59 zaysim of heter levatel the isser. That's the shitas ha-Mechaber over here. The Ramah we didn't discuss yesterday. The Ramah holds that the bones are not mitzareh. So in this case that we mentioned, it will be usher. The Ramah agrees that the bones are not mitzaref im ha'isser in order to mevatel them. The bones do not need bittul. The reason the bones don't need bittul is because although we mentioned yesterday that the bones are usher to eat, based on the Rambam we discussed beforehand, but the tam of the bones for sure is not usher. Why is there no isser in the tam of the bones? Mentioned yesterday a few reasons, either because the bones don't produce tam, maybe because the tam that they produce, Chazal never astered, mitzad tam kicker, or maybe be'etzem it really is shaykh in the issue of tam kicker, but the Pri Megadim says that the bones have tam kolish, and it's because they have tam kolish, so therefore it doesn't have the power to aster. But in any event, that's the tam. But the Ramah agrees that you don't have to mevatel the tam of the bones, but he says you can't use the bones in order to letzaref levatel the heter. Now, why is that? Why would that be? You might have thought, well, maybe we don't hold the bones could be used to absorb taste. That might be the reason, but that can't be because the Ramah holds that the bones of heter are letzaref. Meaning, if I don't have to, when I'm looking at my pot of heter, I'm allowed to look also at the bones of the heter, and the bones of the heter are going to be there to absorb some of the tam of the isser. And therefore, so the bones do absorb tam. So if the bones absorb tam, ma'ishna, the bones of heter from the bones of isser. So the Pri Megadim asks his kasha, tries to figure this out, and he wants to say the following. He wants to say that maybe the reason is more of a lumdisha answer of the Pri Megadim. We mentioned a second ago that one of the reasons why, at least, and the Pri Megadim's primary reason, why the bones don't aser, despite the fact that they are aser to eat, according to the Rambam, so why don't the bones create an isser here? Says the Pri Megadim, because the bones produce tam, but tam kolish. Because it's tam kolish, so tam kolish can't aster. It's a weak tam. Says Pri Megadim a very interesting thing. He says, wait a minute, because it has weak tam in it, so therefore it doesn't make sense that now it's going to be used to levatel the isser. Why? It's because the principle of heter, bittul, very, very important principle. We'll learn about this in the next sif as well. The principle of bittul means you have two opposing forces with each other, isser v'heter. At kama the bones are usher to eat, but not only usher to eat, they even produce tam. They're really whose team are the bones on? The bones are really on the team of the isser because they're the same thing. They just don't have the power to create isser, but they are really in the same team. They're like the pawns or something. I don't know. They don't really do anything, but they do have. So therefore, it says the Pri Megadim, mitzad the principle of bittul, we can't allow for the bones to be on the opposing team to mevatel the isser. Okay, that's the pshat of the Pri Megadim. Others explain more simple, more balabatish. They say that be'etzem, no pun intended, really the bones of the isser should be there to mevatel the isser, just the same way the bones of the heter are mevatel. But what's the difference? Just because we'll make a mistake, it's going to look very strange to most people. To people like me, I get confused all the time, right? So you're going to tell me I can't eat the bones, but they're used mevatel the isser. I can't get. And before you know it, we're going to start making mistakes. Before you know it, you're going to start saying, oh, the bones are mutter, and I can eat the bones, I can do this, and before you know it, everything's going to break down. So in order to keep things sort of consistent and less confusing, Chazal say the bones can't be used, levatel, these bones are bones of isser. Okay, we mentioned also yesterday, I just want to go over the pot. So the Mechaber mentions that the pot is ein mitzarefes lo me'isser v'lo me'heter. The pot can't be used. And the question is, why not? What's the difference of the pot and the bones? At Kamba, we're using the bones, levatel the isser, because we're assuming that the tam of the isser is nivla into the bones, so then we should be able to use the pot. And we should assume that the tam of the Isser is nivela into the bat. So, and we all know, everybody knows, right? It's one of the most basic halachas that every school child knows, that the pots have tam of Isser, and always have tam. That's why we have milchik pots and fleshik pots. The whole concept of milchik and fleshik pots starts because we assume that the pots absorb tam. Not only do they absorb tam, but they actually absorb all the tam. The entire walls of the pot are to be assumed to have completely absorbed with all the tam. So why over here are we not using the pot? So the easiest understanding is as follows, that it's like this. And the easiest way to understand this is that although the walls of the pot are used, the walls of the pot absorb, but we have to always go l'chumra mikan l'kan. So for example, if I take a pot and I cooked in it yesterday some milchik dish, now today I want to cook a fleshik dish, so we have to assume that the entire walls of the pot are absorbed with milchik. Now, is that really true? Is the entire walls milchik? We don't really know. We don't know how much is really absorbed there, but we have to go to chumrah to assume that the maximum has happened, meaning that the entire walls were absorbed with milchiks. But in our studio, you want to use that concept lahakel. So we're going to have to go l'chumra, the other extreme, to assume that no tam has been absorbed at all. So basically, you always have to go l'chumra mikan l'kan. Okay, sif base. B'medvar murim she'at samay se'isr mitzdarfen ima heter keshenafla chaticha nevela l'kedera heter keshehi chaya. Aval in nizbashla techila v'yacharkach nafla l'kedera heter. Then at samay sheba mitzdarfen ima isr lefi shebalao mibasar nevela keshenizbashla levada. The Mechaber qualifies what he said in the previous sif. That although we just said in the previous sif that the bones are used in order to mitzaref against the Isser, and they certainly are not being used on the Isser team to create the Isser, that's only true if I dropped my piece in the Vela when it was raw. I took a raw piece in the Vela with the bone and I dropped it into my cholent. But, says the Mechaber here, if I first cook up my nevela, let's say I marinated first my pot, I have a little pan I fried on top, then I take that piece and I drop it into the cholent. So then I'm going to look at the bone. So using this example, I have a piece of meat that was being cooked, and then I throw it in. When I threw it in, it had 1 kazayas of meat, 1 kazayas of bone, 2 kazasim in total. I throw it into 59 kazasim of heter cholent. So in this case, says the Mechaber, it's going to aser. I have actually 2 kazasim of Isser, 1 is meat, and the bones is now considered Isser, and that's not going to now aser my cholent. That's the Mechaber paskins. Now why? Yeah. So he definitely is not, and we'll see in a second in the next sif. So very good. We'll get to Chanan in a second. The Pri Megadim explains the halacha based on Chanan. But before we get to Chanan, and you're right, that's the most intuitive explanation. So the Be'er Hativ, interesting, the Nasikim don't even explain this halacha, but the Be'er Hativ does. And he brings that from the Torah as follows. He says that v'lo sagi shishim neged abasar and avela the shema nisma'et abasar b'bishulai v'nichnas bat samais kein isa b'tur. He says the chshash here is something else. He says it's not about Chanan. This is about chshash. What happened in the example that I provided? In the example that I provided, the person, when they threw it into the cholent pot, had 1 and 1 of meat and 1 of bones. But the question is, how much was there when you started marinating it? When I put it into the original frying pan, I fried my nevela meat first for an hour, and was sitting there with sauce and everything and cooking up. How much meat was then when I dropped it in? Perhaps it was 2 kazasim, and it was nisma'it. It went down, and then all the taste got absorbed into the bones. So it's not that, like it sounds like the Mechaber, that we're assuming that we somehow produced more Isser. No. As according to the Mechaber, very important, because he does not hold of Chanan, you can never have more Isser than you start with. There's no concept of creating Isurim. If you began the world with only 1 kazayas of Isser, you only have in your world 1 kazayas of Isser. That's it. That kazayas will get distributed wherever. It can only become batal, but you can't create in Isser, according to the Mechaber. So in our sugya, it's not that from the 1 kazayas of Isser we magically turned into 2 kazasim. It's that we began with 2 kezesim, or we're choshish, we began with 2 kezesim, and now with nismayit, the tam got absorbed into the bones, and the bones got completely absorbed with all that tam of the meat, but that meat is no longer here, and it's that which I threw into the cholent pot, effectively bringing me to 2 kezesim of nevela. That's the way the Mechaber explains it. But according to that, if you knew exactly how much meat was there originally, the woman, the lady says, I remember, I took out the package, I even still have the package, she can tell you exactly how much meat was on there. It says on the package how much meat and how much bones, whatever, and she weighed it, who knows what. So then we would be able to make it. She says, I know exactly, I measured it. It was 1 kazayas of meat, 1 kazayas of bones. Also, bones are never in this mite. And I threw that in, and so therefore she says, so then you can be makel according to that explanation. However, comes along the Pri Megadim, and he says a whole new explanation, based on what you were saying as well. It's all based on Chanan. But now, with Chanan, how is Chanan going to help us here? So it says the Pri Megadim like this. Generally speaking, whenever you're cooking things, you're always cooking them with like water and sauce and whatever. You didn't just, it's a little bit of okimta, but it's not a crazy okimta. So you take your frying pan, and you put your frying pan sauce, and you take your nevela and you put it into the sauce, and you're cooking it up. It says the Pri Megadim, while you're cooking it, what's happening? You now aser the entire pot of sauce. And under the principle of Chanan, we could create isurim. Now you can't turn the bones into Chanan. That can't be, because the bones themselves are nothing. But what happens is, says the Pri Megadim, the sauce becomes aser. That sauce now gets absorbed into the bones. So that's what we're bothered with over here. The sauce that was in the pot that I cooked in the pan gets absorbed in the bones. Why is that problematic? The first pshat is that we're not going to do with Chanan. The tam, the nevela itself, just goes directly into the bones, but the nevela is no longer here, or at least. Yeah, but the difference is that here you actually created more isser. You started off with only 1 kazayas of meat, and afal pikain you can now end up with 2 kazayas. That's the difference. And that's the big nafkamina, that according to the Pri Megadim, even if you knew very clearly, that you only had 1 kazayas of meat to start with, and nothing was nismayit, still it's aser because of Chanan. Also, but he'd be makel if there was no sauce, for example. So that's the... According to the Mechaber himself doesn't really say that much. He just says halacha that we're choshesh. The Be'er Heitev's explanation, the Mechaber, is trying to not work with Chanan. And his explanation is that we're choshesh, that maybe the meat was nisma'it.
Well, why don't you just invoke Isudabak by the...
So they get into Davuk over here. They get back into the whole Davuk sugi, which gets very complicated. But yeah, the Pri Megadim is ignoring Davuk. He's working without Davuk. So that's the explanation of the Pri Megadim. One last point in the Pri Megadim that needs to be clarified is, hold on a second. We learned in the previous Siman yesterday, when you had the sugya of 59 kazesim of heter, 1 kazayas of chelev, 1 kazayas of dam, we said that although you only have 59 heterim, neged 2 isurim, each isser could be used to team up against the other isser. That's what we learned yesterday. So asks the Pri Megadim on himself here, he says, hold on a second. In our sugya, it's really the same thing. Right? Why? Because I have 59 kazesim of heter, my cholent. I dropped into the cholent 2 kazesim, but what did I drop into the cholent? I dropped in tam of meat, and he says I also dropped in tam of sauce. He wants to taina. The tam of meat and the tam of sauce are different. It's true, they are different tastes. So in the bones is not the tam of the nevela. It's the chanan that was produced by the sauce. So since it was the chanan that was produced by the sauce, it has a whole different taste to it. And
it's not going with chanan. You're just saying.
No, Pri Megadim is. Pri Megadim is. Pri Megadim is. I'm sorry, maybe I'm say that the Be'er Heitev explains the Mechaber not based on Chanan. He explains it based on the fact that we're choshesh, that originally you had 2 kazayas of meat, and it diminished. But the Pri Megadim explains his halacha based on Chanan, that we originally only had 1 kazayas of meat, but that 1 kazayas of meat asered all the sauce, and the sauce now went back into the bones, and now I have 1 and 1. But the Pri Megadim asks on himself, if I drop that into a pot of cholent, hooray, you now have 2 tamim, the tam of nevela and the tam of the sauce, which is absorbed in the bones. And why is that not like the previous siman, where we had the dam and the chelev? So he answers a very, very fundamental concept, and it's sort of what we just touched upon before, yeah?
Same shame.
Oh, the same shame, right. Exact same thing. So he says a very, very fundamental yesod. He says that the previous siman that allowed for the dam to team up with the heter to mevatel the chalev, and the tam of the chalev to team up with the heter to mevatel the dam, wasn't only because they had different tastes. The Mechaber specifically chose a case that they had a different shame isser. But if they have the same shame isser, even though they have a different tam, they cannot work against each other. And why? Because we mentioned earlier that the whole principle of bittul is that you have two opposing forces. The sugya begins because of that. The tam is after the fact. Once I have two opposing forces, so now I can talk about bittul, and the bittul happens at the point that there's no tam. But if they have the same shame, they're on the same team. So what happens is that the nevela and the bones go into the same team, and although they have different time, it doesn't matter. They cannot work against each other because they are of the same shame. Okay, next halacha. V'shari surim chusmi basar b'chalav chaticha habalua mi iser mitzdarefes levata iser ve'eno hagin kain ki kain balon b'chol isurim chaticha nasis nevela kedilel simen sadi beis. Okay, most important halacha in the entire Taruvis, the machlokes the Mechaber the Ramah about whether we hold of Chanan b'shari surim, even though we've been saying it literally every single minute for the past 2 days. I felt like, but this is where the Mechaber the Ramah speak about it in Hilchos Taruvis. The machlokes Mechaber the Ramah, do you hold of Chanan b'shari surim? They mentioned this already in Sadi Beis, but we mentioned it along the way over the last few days. Just to remind ourselves the following two very important points to emphasize. Point number one, the Ramah's chumrah that we say Chanan b'shari surim is most likely, this is the general consensus, it's only an Issa D'Rabbanan. It's not a Deraisa. Aleph. The idea of Chanan by Basar B'cholav is for sure Deraisa. So by Basar B'cholav it's a Deraisa. By Shari Surim the Mechaber holds Mutter. The Ramah who holds as Aser most likely is holding a D'Rabbanan. Why? What's the difference? Why by Basar B'cholav would it be an Issa Deraisa and by Shari Surim Issa D'Rabbanan? And why would Chazal even answer it then? So the explanation is as follows. When it comes to Basar B'cholav, the Isser of Basar B'cholav is not just, or not really, about eating a taruvis of Basar B'cholav. It sounds like that's what it is. It's just, you're eating the milk and meat mixed together. If that's all that it was, then we would not be able to say Chanan, because as follows. If the Isser was just a Isser of taruvis, you are eating meat and milk together, well, the definition of taruvis is tam, at least in the case of these things. So as long as there's no tam, it's not a taruvis. So if I take my meat and I put the milk in there and I only had 50 kazesim and I added on 10 later on, right now there's no taruvis, it's shvid mutter. But the Isser Basar B'cholav is to eat an Isser, the Isser Achila at least, is to eat something that was cooked with Basar B'cholav. Once it was cooked, it now becomes a new shame Isser. There's a new shame Isser called Basar B'cholav. So once I cooked the milk and meat together, this meat is effectively an avela. The avela is the Basar B'cholav. It's a new shame Isser. And that Isser can't be removed. You can't remove that Isser. It was created. It's now here. So that's the reason why we say Chanan by Basar B'cholav. It's because it's not about you're constantly thinking, oh, you're eating milk and meat together. You're eating a piece of meat that was cooked with milk. That's the Isser. And once that would happen, it now has on it a chalo shem Isser that cannot be removed. By Basar B'cholav, there's no Isser of eating a teruvis. The Isser is eating the vela. Just teruvis is saying, even though it's but teruvis, it's not batal. You can still eat it until there's no longer time. And that's the reason why by Shari Surim we don't say Chanan midiraisa. The Ramah who holds that we do say Chanan, that's a D'Rabbanan, that's most likely a Chashash, that Chazal were machmir, maybe things will get confusing, like all the D'Rabbanans that we have. Sif Dalet. Misharim deroita v'bekipa v'bechatichos. Straightforward halacha, the Mechaber tells us that when we are considering what is used to mevatel the Isser, use the rota, the sauce, the kippah, the dak, shabasar, the tavlin, the asep, the shula gedera, the things that are sitting at the bottom of the gedera, ubechaticha is the pieces of meat. Umeshayrin a heter ve'isser, k'moshabol lefanenu. When you're being meshayr, the isser ve'heter, it has to be what's in front of you. Alpha pisha haya beheter yoser metchila, benisma'et bebishulai, benivla bekedera. Even though, says the Mechaber, you know, or you thought you knew that when you started cooking these two things together, you originally had enough heter to mevatel the isser. The woman remembers that there was 60 kezesim of cholent, and this piece that she threw in, what she now discovered was an avela, is she remembers it being a kazayas, and there was 60 kezesim of heter, but when we measured it now, we see there's only 59 kezesim. So we say we have to see it from what's in front of us right now. V'hani mili b'min b'she'eno minoi, avo imhu min b'minoi, mish'arin gam b'meshe bala kedera, v'oime b'doifne kedera, u'mish'arin ze b'oimed yafe, v'roina so ki'ilu hu be'en, avo masha kola v'ovad machma sa'or, einu mitztaref shezeh kola legamre. Mechaber says that this chumrah that I'm telling you, that you have to use the information that's in front of you now, and you can't use the information that you knew originally, that's only true by min b'she'eno mino. By min b'mino, you can mekel to rely on the information that you had at the beginning, that if you knew that at the beginning you had enough to mevatel, and right now in front of you, and you bring it to the Rav, or whoever's measuring this thing, discovers that you don't have enough to mevatel, says the Mechaber, by min b'mino, you can mekel to assume that it really was batel, and the tam is only absorbed in the pot. However, the Mechaber says, if you know the tam got evaporated, then for sure you can't be mitzdarif. Let's just speak out very quickly over here the following. What's the difference between min b'mino and min b'she'eno mino? We spoke it out a few times, but it's probably another very fundamental yesod in Isser v'heter that we have to always keep in mind. Min b'mino, tam ke'ikr, is always the Rabbanon. It can't be a deraisa. And min b'she'eno mino is a deraisa. Why? For a very simple reason. The whole concept of tam ke'ikr and the whole concept of shishim is an issue of can you taste it. It's not a lumdish issue as much as more of a balabatish basic concept. That in all hichos bittul, if you can recognize the object, it's eino batel. So as long as you can taste it, it's recognizable, therefore it's eino batel. By min b'she'eno mino, it's recognizable, therefore it's not batel until you have shishim. By min b'mino, you don't recognize it immediately. And therefore, it's always batel. It doesn't matter that Tom's floating around, because since you can't detect it, it's not recognizable, therefore it's batel. Midrabanan Chazal made the chumrah. And that's the difference of min mino mish'eno mino, Rabban deraisa. And the Mechaber is saying is, by deraisa, we are machmir to use the information in front of us. You can't use the information that you knew up front. So stop here. What?
Based on what you're saying, what you wrote,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So that's the difference. Tomorrow we'll just clarify a little bit about this distinction of the Mechaber, this case, this chumrah of what you knew, what you didn't know.
The question is,